welcome to everybody. My name is Alex Pong. I am a Global Programs Manager at 4-Day Week Global, which is a nonprofit that is devoted to spreading word about and promoting the 4-day work week and other kinds of shorter work weeks around the world. I'm also the author of a book about the 4-day week, and for the last few years have been looking at how organizations, companies, schools, etc., move to shorter work weeks, how they do it, what challenges they face, and what benefits they get from it. One of the things that has come up is a question of, okay, so if I'm not the person who is in charge of a company, if I'm not a founder or CEO, how do I make the case for a shorter work week in my organization? And so what I want to do in this session is talk about that. And I'm going to start. I've actually got some slides that I'm going to try to share here. Window, Microsoft PowerPoint, share, and it's still not letting me do this. It looks like, I wonder if I don't have the right app and wants to share contents of your screen. Yeah, so Alana, it seems that maybe I don't have the right permission to do this. I'm not sure what's going on, but however, so what I want to do is explain, first of all, to talk a little bit about the global movement to shorten working hours, then to talk about the evidence in favor of a 4-day week, about the impact that a 4-day week has on revenues, on recruitment and retention, on all the things that businesses tend to be concerned about. And then finally, to say a little bit about kind of the kind of how to make the case, right? To say the ways in which you can pitch a 4-day week so that it speaks to the issues that your managers, your bosses, your board have. So I'm going to try once more. I see Alana's here. See if I can. No, I'm still not getting the ability to share. So I don't know if Alana, maybe if you can put up the slides for me, or let's see what happens. But yeah, let's see if we can grab them. So she's working on this.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I'm also having difficulties. I might bring our tech person in, but
it's a weird thing. Anyway, but while we're working, while we're seeing if the slides can can join us, I should say I have, like I said, I'd written a book about the 4-day week a couple years ago. It actually came out in the United States literally days before the pandemic closed down bookstores, which was like the greatest piece of publishing timing in all of history. What you really want is like the main vehicles for selling your product to disappear when right at the time that you're you're trying to sell them. Ah, fantastic. Okay, so we're getting it. However, the pandemic turned out not to slow down the adoption of the 4-day week, but if anything, really accelerated it. So, and at this point, we have literally hundreds of companies around the world, ranging from 2 people to thousands, who have moved permanently to 4-day weeks or other kinds of work weeks. Before writing shorter, I also had my previous book was about the hidden role of rest in the lives of super creative and prolific people, and in a sense was a kind of prequel to Shorter, which is about how organizations can take can create more space for rest for everybody not just for like Nobel laureates or famous writers or so on. If we can go to the next slide. So what I want to do is talk about the global movement, talk about the evidence in favor of a shorter work week, and then finally to talk about how to sort of make the case. All right, next slide. I don't have the ability to control these myself, do I? Probably not. Okay, so global movement. Next slide. This is something that actually is, the shift to a 4-day work week is genuinely global, right? It's something that we have seen not in Scandinavia, in other European countries, but also in North America, in Colombia, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, also in Japan and Korea, 2 countries that have had to invent their own words for working yourself to death. So it is a genuinely global movement. It's also one that cuts across a variety of industries. Next slide, please. So lots of the firms that have done it have been creative services or professional firms like Else London, which is shown here, which is a kind of design and marketing agency. Next slide. But we've also seen it in call centers. This is one B2B call center in Glasgow, Scotland. If you've ever done telemarketing, you know, people measure absolutely everything in these places. They're very numbers, very performance oriented. Next slide. You also see it in manufacturing. So this is A.E. Harris, which is a metalworks in Birmingham that is the makers of cookware and other kinds of custom fabrications. Next slide. And then it's also, and you see it in other kinds of places that have hourly workers, so it's not just people we consider to be creatives, but it's really something that turns out to be accessible to just about everybody. All right, so let's talk about the evidence for a 4-day week, mainly from the perspective of the organization. The next slide, please. One of the first concerns that managers and leaders have is what impact does a 4-day week have on revenues, on profitability, on kind of the financial lifeblood or viability of companies. And here the news is, the evidence is pretty straightforward and pretty unambiguous. Companies that move to 4-day weeks consistently demonstrate that they are able to do so without sacrificing productivity, without sacrificing revenues or profits. And I should say, when I talk about moving to 4-day weeks or other kinds of shorter work weeks, I'm really talking about reducing working hours without cutting salaries. So we're not talking about moving to a 4-day week, but you take a 20% pay cut. We're talking about and we're also not talking about individuals just choosing this for themselves. We're talking about an organizational change. One of the places that made this change fairly early is a company called Wuwa Brothers in Korea, just Korea's equivalent of DoorDash or Deliveroo. The next slide, please. And they began shortening working hours in, I want to say 2015, when they moved to a 37.5-hour week and then reduced it to 35 in 2017. At the same time, their revenues grew tenfold, from 29 billion won to 319 billion. They also grew from a company of a couple hundred people to a couple thousand. And actually last year, they were sold to a German company for about $4 billion. So this is a particularly dramatic example of a company that's able to grow even while reducing working hours in a highly competitive market in an industry where overwork and long hours or burnout is the norm. But it's not especially unusual. no company that moves permanently to a 4-day week reports having to take a hit to its bottom line. There are lots of other examples of this, but which we've documented. In the interest of time, I'm not going to throw all of them at you because, frankly, seeing a whole bunch of these charts begins to get boring. Rather, if we can move on to the next slide, please. It's also, though, something that has positive impacts on the ways that organizations work and on the ways in which people work together. So in Copenhagen, there's a company called IIH Nordic, which is another web services firm. They moved to a 4-day week starting in early 2015. And they've documented using a tool called Officevibe, basically sentiment in the office, right? How happy people are with their work, how people are getting along, and so on. And if I can have the next slide, this is one example of those results. So in early 2015, you can see this is a slide showing relationship with peers, which covers communication, trust levels, collaboration. And what we see is that early on, the score takes a bit of a dip when they first implement a 4-day week, but you can see it shoots up, and then there are a few rises and falls, but consistently goes up until the company is in the top couple percent of firms who score highly for trust, collaboration, and communication. These are the kinds of things that managers love to see, because high levels of communication, trust, collaborative ability, these are all things that correlate to companies performing really, really well. And likewise, there are other there's plenty of other data of this sort that indicates that when done well, a 4-day week is something that does not separate workers or pit them against each other, right? It's not kind of a zero-sum game where everybody is trying to figure out how to get their own 4-day week, whether it's at someone else's expense or not. But really, it sets up conditions for people to have to figure out how, by working better together, you can all go home at the end of the day Thursday and enjoy a 3-day weekend every week. Next slide, please. There's also interesting, one of the questions that comes up sometimes is, isn't just a 4-day week a way of intensifying work, right? Forcing people to work harder, it's won't it in the long run result in higher levels of stress, burnout, etc.? Well, this is a medical documentation company in London called Synergy Vision, and they ran a survey before beginning a 6-month trial of a 4-day week, and then 6 months into it. If I could have the next slide, what we see is some stuff that's not surprising, and a couple really interesting things. So, for one thing, the percentage of people who report themselves as very happy at work, scoring 9 or 10 out of 10, goes from about 12% right before the trial begins to just over 50% 6 months later. Not surprisingly, lots of the percentage of people saying that they have hobbies, that they have good work-life balance, these things go up. The sense that work impinges on home goes down. But for me, one of the surprising ones is the bottom score. The percentage of people who say that they can keep up with work actually rises from 50% to 79%, even as the length of the work week goes down by 20%. And what that tells us is that the kind of psychological sense that people are able to get all of their work done, that they have the kind of level of control, that they're able to focus over their time, that they're able to focus on essential tasks, that they have less in the way of distractions or busy work. All of that means that all of that contributes to a sense that people are able to get done the work that really matters. So again, this suggests that this doesn't just have to be about work becoming, more intense, but rather that it can inspire organizations to figure out how to redesign work time, so that everybody has more time to do the stuff that really matters. Next slide. So I'm not going to talk about what are the benefits in terms of work-life balance, family time, etc., though those, as you would expect, are pretty substantial. But I want to focus instead on how you make the case if you're not the person in the position to say, we're just going to, we're going to do this. Next slide. And it kind of comes down, I think, to being able to do three things. As the next slide will indicate. The first is explaining or showing how a 4-day week can help your company. It's always cool to hear about places in Sweden or New Zealand who are doing this, but what company owners, what boards want to know is, how can we actually make this work here in our, in our unique environment, in the place for which we're responsible. Also, showing that there's room for shortening the week is a valuable thing. And then finally, identifying some potential first steps. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. You read my mind. First of all, how do you bring it home? I mean, how do you make the case for doing it within within your own company? Well, when you talk to leaders who have been in charge of 4-day week implementation, they tell you that they're doing it for a few big reasons. Recruitment and retention is almost always a big thing. They're doing it to improve work-life balance. Often they have issues with retaining working parents, or people after they have who have young children. They're also often interested in promoting creativity or learning, or opportunities or space for professional development. And then finally, especially in startups, avoiding founder burnout. Now, these are all issues that virtually every company has. These are kind of everyday existential issues. And there's hardly, these days, a company that has not been faced with issues around around recruitment and retention. But the thing about, and so the 4-day week generally is not something that companies undertake out of a desire to rethink the nature of time in late capitalism, or because they're especially idealistic. Right? If you were in the previous session, you heard Heatherly talking about how Bolt decided to trial a 4-day week, out of concerns over recruitment and burnout. And this is very, very common. The 4-day week is a solution to big, everyday existential problems that companies are facing. And so if these are things that your organization is challenged with, one powerful way to make the case for a 4-day week is to connect it to to these issues, and to be able to argue that this isn't just about making people's lives better in some abstract way. It's also about making the company a better place to work that will do a better job of recruiting and retaining people and keeping them over the long run, and making these benefits available not just for employees, but for absolutely everybody. So connecting it to these kinds of big but everyday and very familiar issues is, I think, one way to get leaders, get boards interested in trialing a 4-day week. The next slide, please. The second thing is showing that there's room for shortening the work week. And next, on to the next slide, because the key insight here, in a sense, is that the 4-day week is actually already here, right? Studies show that in the average office, we lose 2 to 3 hours per day to things like poorly run meetings, to distractions, to interruptions, that one quick question that turns into a 10-minute conversation that then takes you another 10 minutes to sort of recover from and get back get refocused on the thing you'd been doing previously, or time lost to badly used sort of technologies. So if you can get a handle on these things, it's actually the case that you can go a long way to doing in 4 days what currently sort of is taking you 5 or more to do. To the extent that you can also connect, you can also gather data about or how much time people are spending in meetings, about the amount of time they're spending on Slack channels, and so on, or I think often the stronger your case can be. However, most of us recognize that, that these are challenges that we have in our in our everyday working lives, that, that particularly with remote work or with hybrid work, that the amount of time we're spending in meetings or sort of on Zoom has only increased, and that this creates an opportunity for all of us to redesign work, to sort of get a handle on some of these things, so that we can then sort of move and to take back this time and to kind of redistribute it, to share it back with employees. Next slide. And then finally, it's always helpful to be able to identify some potential first steps, right? Things, or tangible things that you can do in order to, that's cool. No, go to the next slide. Tangible things you can do in order to make it, or in order to get started. So so for example, if you can talk about or what kind of shorter work week might work best in your organization, or perhaps within your department, right? Whether it's market rhythm, it's or client needs, it's employee needs, being able to say, in companies like ours, most of them go to 4-day weeks and they take off Fridays, or in these sorts of, in our kinds of organizations, almost everyone does a 4-day week, but the customer service people have a rota system so that they're on for 5 days because we've got SLAs or other kinds of commitments that mean that we've got to be available Monday through Friday. If you can also think through a little bit some of the obvious objections that they'll raise, right? What about revenues? What about, won't customers flip out about this? You can, to the extent that you can begin to address sort of those issues or worst case scenarios, that's terrific. I think also being being able to say a little bit about what a successful trial looks like, and that at the end of 6 months or 3 months, if revenues have been the same, if you think about what it is that, or what kind of outcome you want. Probably revenues not changing or going up is something that most places like to see. But then if you can identify 1 or 2 other critical measures, right? Recruitment or retention, happiness in the workplace, according to some measure. If these things trend in a positive direction, then this shows that a 4-day week is viable and delivers benefits to people and to the organization. It's not on the slide, but if, especially in larger places, there is a department or manager who can trial this first, that's always a really helpful thing. It's often the case with big organizations that the first, that there is a trial that's done in one maybe geographical location or in one functional department, and then you learn from that and you scale up rather than having the entire enterprise try and do it at once. The idea here being that there's a bunch of things you can learn in the right place that can guide future experiments. Also, if things go wrong, you're able to kind of contain the damage. And this is how places like the Ford Motor Company in the 1910s and 1920s went to an 8-hour day and then a 5-day week and then an 8-hour day. They actually spent a couple years experimenting with 8-hour days in like the paint shop and the sort of machine tool lab before finally implementing it on the assembly line, which was the beating heart of the company where absolutely everything had to go right. And then the final thing, though, is that it's not necessary to have all the answers at the beginning, because part of what you're doing, part of what companies that successfully implement 4-day weeks do is devolve a lot of responsibility for figuring out how the 4-day week works to employees themselves and to teams. So what this means is that what leaders are doing is not having to answer every single question about how to make a 4-day week work, but rather kind of creating the conditions in which people have the ability and the freedom to experiment quickly, to try new things, to fail fast, to learn from their mistakes, and to make corrections and improvements. So those are being able, so you don't have to have all the answers at the beginning, but having some indication of how to get started can sort of take this from being a kind of abstract idea that sounds good to feeling like something that you could actually try within sort of your company. Next slide, please. So now, I've given a fairly high-level view of sort of the benefits of the 4-day week, giving you a taste of some of the data behind it. But if you're interested in learning more, there are a couple places you can go. The first is 4dayweek.com, where we are adding data, putting up case studies. We're also, for companies that want to try this themselves, but are interested in doing it with some support, with in the presence of other organizations that are moving to 4-day weeks themselves, with a little bit of help from myself and the rest of the team. We're organizing the programs that are bringing together groups of companies who all trial it themselves together. Also, my book, Shorter, talks about how 100 companies redesigned their work weeks, and in particular, how they used design thinking to figure out how to design trials, how to test work weeks, how to fail quickly and ultimately succeed. And then on Twitter, I talk or point people to lots of 4-day week stuff at Ask Pang. And then finally, for if you think that this is something that your organization could be convinced to try, my email address is alex.pang@4dayweek.com. So next slide. So thank you all very much. And I hope that every single one of you is able to bring the 4-day week to your own organizations. I want to, and as a way of concluding, we often it's easy to recognize the value of a 4-day week in our own personal lives, but I've been thinking about the impact that this can have at scale and the benefit that it can have in terms not just of personal wellness or improvements in our work-life balance as individuals, but improvements for everybody. And you think of it this way, that, right, if you go to a 4-day week, assuming you work 50 weeks a year, moving to a 4-day week means you get another 50 days of your life back every year. That's the equivalent of 10 working weeks. So every 5 years, you get back effectively a year of your life. And if you're at a company that has, let's say, 100 people, and everybody does sort of, and you're able to move everybody sort of to a 4-day week, that's what you are generating another 20 years of free time for everybody every single year. Right? This is time you can spend people that translates into more time with children, more time with parents, with doing things within your community, time for hobbies, for professional development. And it is amazing to think about what people are able to do when they have that kind of time, and the possibilities that we can create if we can create that kind of free time together. So with that, I will stop talking and see if people have questions. So I know, Alana, you'd actually sort of put in something at the beginning about advocating for a 4-day week in your own institution. There are a couple colleges that have already implemented 4-day weeks for faculty and staff. So, Mills could be a fast follower, but there's at least some, sort of some precedent for it happening in sort of higher education. So, let's see if other people have, if you want, if people want to come on screen to ask questions live, that might be easier than sort of putting them in the chat. Alana, I think you have the ability to sort of see if people have questions, or you can explain how this works.
Yeah, I'm just popping on to explain, and then I'll come right back off. So
Whatever.
You should see something, I believe, in the top right-hand corner of your screen that is a request to share audio and video. And if you click that, then I get pinged and I can pull you up on the screen. So if you want to ask your question and have your screen on, feel free to do that and I'll pull you up. Cool. Valerie, I see that you're already up here. Do you want to ask a question? Just type in the chat if you meant to do that or if that was an accident.
She has typed in a question about volunteer time off, which is a great question. So if you can say a tiny bit more about sort of VTO programs, I don't know that much about them. That would be, I'd love to. I would, for one, would be happy to be a little better informed about them. Okay, so sort of to answer. Okay, so sort of to kind of answer the question, there are a few companies that when they move to 4-day weeks will suggest to people that they devote, or that they give a certain amount of time to to doing community / volunteer work. I don't know that it's okay. Don't worry about your camera. It actually saves a substantial amount of energy to apparently to leave your camera off on these things. So you're actually doing a good thing. But there are some organizations that will sort of suggest but not require that people spend a certain amount of time doing, doing volunteer work on their 5th day. I think it's something, but even in places that do not require it. It is something that people tend, tend to do. In the surveys that I have done, asking people what they do with their free time, I am impressed at how disgustingly wholesome people turn out to be when you give them more time. They sort of what they report is not that, right, that I'm going to devote more time to like going to bars and getting blackout drunk. Instead, they talk about spending more time with family, getting back into hobbies, cooking for themselves, which is something that's important both as there were like community, there are family benefits. It means you tend to eat healthier, and you also save money because it's cooking for yourself almost always is cheaper than takeout. But as one company founder put it, what people do with their free time is they care. They care for themselves. They care for each other. They take care of their communities. And so I think that that certainly it's that I think there's nothing wrong with encouraging VTO, but it's also something that can happen organically more regularly than we might expect. So, other questions? Yes, people want to help enrich their hobbies and communities and have time to do so without being exhausted on their 1 or 2 days off. Absolutely. Yeah. In the previous session, Tammy was talking about how spending one day on chores and then another day being able to rest, and then basically spending Sunday mainly at church and with family was a really, really great thing. And what I tend to hear is people doing, using that extra day to go to you schedule doctor's appointments, and that's when you have like the repairman come over and so on. That the fact that you don't, that you've got a day of the week in which you can stack all of that stuff up means, number one, that it doesn't interrupt work, so you don't have to take personal time off in order to do that. But second, it also doesn't interfere with your own rest time, right? You don't have to make a choice between going to the dentist and and doing stuff with your church, because you now have more time in which to do both of those things. And that turns out to be like shockingly powerful as a generator of greater levels of happiness and satisfaction. Not to mention the fact that when you've got time for all those things, your life just tends to run better. So, are there other questions that people have? You can either toss them into you can put them in the chat if you like, or as Alana explained, you can raise your hand and you can ask them live. I'm perfectly happy to hear people's voices rather than my own. And I'm sure some of you are probably would be in favor of that as well.
Waiting for people to type their questions. I have some questions of my own that I'm happy to ask.
Yeah.
The first one that I've been thinking about is, there are companies where the precedent, even if it might be in a 40-hour work week, that they're saying it is a 40-hour work week, the precedent is that you work like 50 hours or 60 hours or you never stop. So how do we get those companies, like what is the starting point for them? How do we get them to start scaling back?
Right. Okay. So, right. There are kind of two major answers. One of them is there are some industries where moving down to a 32-hour week is not really quite practicable. I'm thinking of the restaurant industry, for example. But even in those cases, restaurants that have done this, there's still a huge difference between working 4 12-hour days and working like 5 or 6 12-hour days. Like, it's enormous. And the restaurant industry is one where, where hours are long, burnout is a really common thing. It is super difficult to to build a career as a chef and to have time for yourself or for family. And so consequently, you've got a lot of challenges with people staying in the profession, with people being able to both have families and to cook. But in those cases, moving to 4-day weeks is still something that offers some substantial benefits. In other cases, I think what we see is, okay, so there are some companies that will do a kind of staggered approach, like Wuwa Brothers did, where you might go first to 35-hour weeks and then eventually down to 32. There are some that do summer hours, or like a 9-day fortnight. So you've got every other Friday off. And after after, let's say, a couple months, if this is working, you've learned enough about how to improve processes and make meetings shorter, et cetera. And then you can move down to a 4-day week. I think it's also important that we, in contrast to, let's say, 2 or 3 years ago, we have more of a language for talking about what the 4-day week signifies in terms of professional achievement or accomplishment or competence, right? When I started working on this stuff back in 2017, it was really a challenge to find companies that had done this, that were willing to go on the record and explain what they had done and why. Moving to a 4-day week traditionally was something that companies did when they were in trouble, right? Revenues were falling, you couldn't make payroll, and so, or demand was soft, so you moved to a 4-day week and you cut everyone's salary. The idea of just moving to a 4-day week while keeping salaries the same was just like this completely crazy idea from outer space. These days, though, when companies do it, they announce it on LinkedIn, or they do a press release. And because enough places have done it so that there is a language for describing it as an expression of your values, of your concern for your people, and also as a sign of your professionalism, that you can do in 4 days what the competition needs 5 or 6 days to do. So I think that sort of creates a space in which it's easier, or at least a little bit easier, for leaders, for CEOs to think about the 4-day week as communicating good things about the companies that they lead, as well as being simply financially viable and delivering delivering work-life benefits, lowering stress levels, making careers more sustainable, etc. The final thing is that I think that the 4-day week is something that tends to be self-evidently good for people who are a little further along in their careers, right? Or people who've been, the kind of ideal candidate for a 4-day week is someone who's been working in a profession long enough to feel confident that they have plenty of skills. They know kind of what's good and what's bad about the way people conventionally work, and given the opportunity, they have enough experience so that they could redesign their jobs. Also, bonus points if they're at that point in their lives where they've got partners, they maybe have young children or other commitments, so that they see immediately the benefit of having another day off, every week. And so, for them, the idea of applying all of that like technical knowledge and craft wisdom to figuring out how to do the same work more effectively, to focus so that they can do it in 4 days rather than like in 6. That's actually a route that, sort of allows them to satisfy a lot of the same kinds of impulses that previously you had expressed working longer hours, but it's far, far more sustainable, right? Figuring out how to do all of that in 4 days rather than 5.5 sets you up for a challenge that you can, it reorients you away from thinking about like professional devotion or dedication to your job as expressed principally by the amount of time you spend, and begins to nudge you toward thinking about it in terms of how effectively you're able to work. And ultimately, maybe, all right, you figured out how to do it in 4 days now. Maybe a few years from now, you'll be able to figure out how to do all of this in 3. And, which is over the long run a far more sustainable way of thinking about your careers than having to imagine 20 years from now continuing to have to sleep under your desk in order to or do your work. End of rant.
Thank you so much for your answer. I have not seen anyone else say that they want to come on, but I do have another question, and we have 4
Please.
minutes, so
Yeah.
I'll hand that to you, and then we'll wrap up. Um, I'm thinking about people who either are self-employed or they're salaried and on an individual level don't know how to say no to things, and maybe are working like they want a 4-day work week, but they're struggling to actually work within those bounds. And I was wondering what advice you have for people who are trying to get there on an individual level but are coming up against those kind of barriers.
Right. I think that sort of the two really essential things are to recognize the degree to which we have been programmed to engage in acts of self-exploitation, as sociologists call it. That it is one of the things that managers have discovered in the last 20 years is that you can extract a lot more labor out of people when they think they are giving it voluntarily and they believe that they are doing so as an expression of their passion than you can extract from them, than you can coerce out of people. It is, and I think that recognizing how much of our working lives or our assumptions about work have been structured by by social norms, by professional norms, by ideas about the necessity of being passionate that encourage us to make sacrifices on behalf of employers, on behalf of jobs that, that as Sarah Jaffe says in her book, do not love us back, is an important thing, for an important first step for solopreneurs or people who largely work by themselves. For everybody else, I think the important thing is don't do it alone. That, it turns out that there are, the most powerful way to resist these structures is to fight them together. That, as we said in the last session, collective action turns out to be the most powerful form of self-care that there is. And that, part of what makes moving to a 4-day week really powerful in companies and organizations is that you have the reinforcement, you have the kind of collective action, you have of the effort on the part of everybody to construct new working practices, new social norms around free time, to to encourage everybody to good behavior, to developing and maintaining better boundaries between work time and personal time. And that being able to do this, as part of a group turns out to be so much more powerful and in many ways a lot easier than doing it by yourself. So that's my answer. Partly because it just turned 12 o'clock, so everybody now gets to turn into a pumpkin. So thank you very much, Alana, for sort of running the slides. That was really terrific. I appreciate your sort of intervention there. As I told everybody, alex.pang@4dayweek.com if you're interested in learning more or making this pitch to your own organizations. There we go. There's the book, etc. And drop your own links if you want to connect. So thank you all very, very much. And good luck in your own 4-day week journeys.